Ryan Carter, a 9-year-old boy with sharp instincts and an unshakable sense of loyalty, has always believed that the truth must come out, no matter the cost. On what was supposed to be the happiest day of his father's life, as Michael Carter prepared to say "I do" to Sophie Turner, Ryan made a bold decision. He stepped forward in the middle of the church, stopping the wedding in front of hundreds of stunned guests. But what made him brave enough to speak up? Who is Sophie Turner, really? What dark secrets is she hiding beneath her perfect wedding gown? And why did Ryan's warning not only save his father's life, but also trigger a chain of dangerous events no one saw coming? Stay tuned to uncover this shocking truth. And before we dive deeper, let me know where you're watching from today. And if you believe that courage and honesty always win, don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss another story. The warm afternoon sun streamed through the tall glass windows of St. Augustine Church, casting a golden glow over the guests seated in the pews. Excited murmurs filled the air as family and friends whispered to one another, their eyes fixed on the grand wooden doors at the back of the church, eagerly awaiting the arrival of the bride. At the altar stood Michael Carter, a successful architect in his late 30s, dressed sharply in a navy blue tuxedo. He shifted slightly, adjusting his tie as nervous excitement bubbled inside him. Today was supposed to be the happiest day of his life, the day he would marry Sophie Turner, the woman he believed to be his future. Beside him stood his 9-year-old son, Ryan Carter, gripping a small velvet pillow that carried the wedding rings. Ryan's dark brown hair was neatly combed, and his little tuxedo matched his father's perfectly. He looked the part of the perfect ring-bearer, but inside he was anything but calm. "You look great, Dad," Ryan whispered, shifting the pillow in his hands. His voice was steady, but his hazel eyes flickered with unease. Michael, oblivious to his son's distress, flashed him a warm smile and ruffled his hair. "Thanks, buddy. You're the best ring-bearer a dad could ask for." Ryan forced a small smile, but his heart pounded in his chest. He wasn't nervous because of the ceremony. He was terrified because he knew something that no one else did, something that could destroy this wedding before it even began. As the first notes of the wedding march echoed through the church, the congregation rose to their feet. The massive wooden doors swung open, revealing Sophie in all her bridal elegance. She floated down the aisle, a vision in a lace wedding gown, her blonde hair cascading in soft waves around her shoulders. Her blue eyes sparkled with emotion as she approached the altar. But Ryan wasn't fooled. He had seen the real Sophie, the one she hid from everyone else. "You look stunning," Michael whispered as Sophie reached him, his voice filled with admiration. Sophie smiled sweetly, placing her hands in his. "I can't wait to start our life together," she murmured. The officiant cleared his throat, beginning the ceremony. His words drifted over the guests like a gentle breeze, but for Ryan, every second that passed felt like a ticking time bomb. His grip on the ring pillow tightened until his knuckles turned white. He had to make a decision. Did he speak now, or forever hold his peace? Because if this wedding happened, his father might not live long enough to regret it. The weight of his secret pressed down on Ryan's chest like a boulder. Every second that passed felt like a countdown to disaster. He glanced up at his father, standing tall with a look of pure adoration in his eyes as he gazed at Sophie. He didn't see it. He didn't see the danger standing right in front of him. Ryan swallowed hard, his hands tightening around the velvet pillow. He had to act now. If he waited any longer, if he let this wedding continue, there might not be a chance to save his dad. The officiant's voice carried through the church, steady and calm. "If anyone can show just cause why these two should not be joined in holy matrimony, let them speak now or forever hold their peace." A pause. Ryan's heart slammed against his ribs. This was it. Wait. The single word rang out like a gunshot in the silent church. Every head turned. Gasps rippled through the guests. Michael stiffened, his brows furrowing as he turned toward his son. Ryan's pulse pounded in his ears, but he forced himself to meet his father's confused gaze. "You can't marry her." His voice wavered but didn't break. "She's lying to you, Dad. She's not who she says she is." A murmur spread through the crowd like wildfire. Sophie's face paled. But she recovered quickly, letting out a soft, almost pitying laugh. "Oh, Ryan," she said, shaking her head. Sweetheart, I know this is hard for you. A new family, a new mother. But it's okay. I understand. Her voice dripped with honey, but Ryan knew the venom underneath. Michael's expression darkened. Ryan, what are you talking about? Ryan turned to him, desperation clawing at his chest. She's been lying to you, Dad. I heard her talking to someone named Mark. They were planning something bad. Sophie's smile faltered. Michael, she murmured, reaching for his arm. He's just a child. He doesn't understand what he's saying. Michael hesitated. Ryan's breath caught. No. He had to make him see. I heard you, Sophie, he pushed on, voice rising. You were talking about money, about how Dad had no idea what was coming, about how you were going to get rid of him. The tension in the room snapped tight. The whispering stopped. Michael's hands clenched at his sides. Sophie, his voice was dangerously quiet now. Tell me that's not true. Sophie's blue eyes flicked to the exit, just for a second, but Ryan saw it. Then, just as fast, she turned back to Michael, tears welling up in her eyes. Fake. Completely fake. Michael, please, she whispered, stepping closer to him. You're not going to believe this, are you? A scared little boy who just doesn't want his dad to move on? Michael hesitated, conflict twisting his features. Ryan felt the last bit of his control slip. Check her phone, he blurted out. She's been texting Mark this whole time. Sophie sucked in a breath. A flash of fear darted across her face before she masked it again. Michael turned to her. Give me your phone. Sophie let out a breathless laugh. Michael? Now. A beat of silence. Then in one sharp movement, Sophie bolted. She whirled, her white dress flaring around her, and shoved through the crowd. Gasps turned into shouts. Guests scrambled out of her way. Michael stood frozen for half a second before snapping into motion. Sophie! Stop. Ryan felt his knees go weak as his father took off after her, sprinting down the aisle. For a brief, horrifying moment, Ryan thought she might actually make it. She was fast, her heels clicking against the marble floor as she rushed toward the doors. But then, the best man, Jack, stepped in her way. Sophie barely had time to react before Jack blocked her path, arms outstretched. Where you running? Off to? He asked, voice calm but firm. Sophie skidded to a stop, chest heaving, her hands clenched at her sides. Michael caught up, panting. Give me the phone. Sophie's jaw tightened. Michael, don't. The phone, Sophie. Slowly, her fingers curled around the device. But she didn't hand it over. Instead, she threw it. With a sharp flick of her wrist, the phone soared through the air, straight toward the marble floor. It shattered on impact. A collective gasp filled the church. Michael's face twisted with realization. He turned to her, eyes blazing. What did you do? Sophie's breathing was ragged. Then, suddenly, she smiled. A slow, knowing smile. And Ryan knew in that moment that she had just destroyed the evidence. The next second, the doors burst open and 2 police officers stormed inside. Everything happened at once. Step away from her, one officer barked. Sophie Turner, you're under arrest. Sophie stiffened. For what? She snapped. For conspiracy to commit fraud, the officer replied coolly. We've been investigating you for months. Michael took a sharp breath. Wait, what? The officer didn't look away from Sophie. This isn't her first time pulling something like this. He glanced at Ryan. But thanks to your son, she won't get the chance to do it again. Ryan's breath hitched. Sophie's face twisted with rage. The mask was gone. She turned to Ryan, eyes burning. You little brat, she spat. You ruined everything. Michael stepped in front of his son. No, he said, voice steel. He saved me. The officers grabbed Sophie's arms, snapping cuffs around her wrists. Ryan stood there, heart pounding, as they dragged her toward the exit. But as she was led away, she turned one last time, locking eyes with him. And then she smirked. A chill ran down Ryan's spine. And just like that, she was gone. The weight of his secret pressed down on Ryan's chest like a boulder. Every second that passed felt like a countdown to disaster. He glanced up at his father, standing tall with a look of pure adoration in his eyes as he gazed at Sophie. He didn't see it. He didn't see the danger standing right in front of him. Ryan swallowed hard, his hands tightening around the velvet pillow. He had to act now. If he waited any longer, if he let this wedding continue, there might not be a chance to save his dad. The officiant's voice carried through the church, steady and calm. If anyone can show just cause why these two should not be joined in holy matrimony, let them speak now, or forever hold their peace. A pause. Ryan's heart slammed against his ribs. This was it. Wait. The single word rang out like a gunshot in the silent church. Every head turned. Gasps rippled through the guests. Michael stiffened, his brows furrowing as he turned toward his son. Ryan's pulse pounded in his ears, but he forced himself to meet his father's confused gaze. You can't marry her. His voice wavered but didn't break. She's lying to you, Dad. She's not who she says she is. A murmur spread through the crowd like wildfire. Sophie's face paled, but she recovered quickly, letting out a soft, almost pitying laugh. Oh, Ryan, she said, shaking her head. Sweetheart, I know this is hard for you. A new family, a new mother. But it's okay. I understand. Her voice dripped with honey, but Ryan knew the venom underneath. Michael's expression darkened. Ryan, what are you talking about? Ryan turned to him, desperation clawing at his chest. She's been lying to you, Dad. I heard her talking to someone named Mark. They were planning something bad. Sophie's smile faltered. Michael, she murmured, reaching for his arm. He's just a child. He doesn't understand what he's saying. Michael hesitated. Ryan's breath caught. No, he had to make him see. I heard you, Sophie, he pushed on, voice rising. You were talking about money, about how Dad had no idea what was coming, about how you were going to get rid of him. The tension in the room snapped tight. The whispering stopped. Michael's hands clenched at his sides. Sophie. His voice was dangerously quiet now. Tell me that's not true. Sophie's blue eyes flicked to the exit. Just for a second. But Ryan saw it. Then, just as fast, she turned back to Michael, tears welling up in her eyes. Fake. Completely fake. Michael, please, she whispered, stepping closer to him. You're not going to believe this, are you? A scared little boy who just doesn't want his dad to move on? Michael hesitated, conflict twisting his features. Ryan felt the last bit of his control slip. Check her phone, he blurted out. She's been texting Mark this whole time? Sophie sucked in a breath. A flash of fear darted across her face before she masked it again. Michael turned to her. Give me your phone. Sophie let out a breathless laugh. Michael? Now. A beat of silence. Then in one sharp movement, Sophie bolted. She whirled, her white dress flaring around her, and shoved through the crowd. Gasps turned into shouts. Guests scrambled out of her way. Michael stood frozen for half a second before snapping into motion. Sophie, stop! Ryan felt his knees go weak as his father took off after her, sprinting down the aisle. For a brief, horrifying moment, Ryan thought she might actually make it. She was fast, her heels clicking against the marble floor as she rushed toward the doors. But then, the best man, Jack, stepped in her way. Sophie barely had time to react before Jack blocked her path, arms outstretched. Where you running off to? He asked, voice calm but firm. Sophie skidded to a stop, chest heaving, her hands clenched at her sides. Michael caught up, panting. Give me the phone. Sophie's jaw tightened. Michael, don't. The phone, Sophie. Slowly, her fingers curled around the device, but she didn't hand it over. Instead, she threw it. With a sharp flick of her wrist, the phone soared through the air, straight toward the marble floor. It shattered on impact. A collective gasp filled the church. Michael's face twisted with realization. He turned to her, eyes blazing. What did you do? Sophie's breathing was ragged. Then, suddenly, she smiled. A slow, knowing smile. And Ryan knew in that moment that she had just destroyed the evidence. The next second, the doors burst open, and 2 police officers stormed inside. Everything happened at once. Step away from her, one officer barked. Sophie Turner, you're under arrest. Sophie stiffened. For what? She snapped. For conspiracy to commit fraud, the officer replied coolly. We've been investigating you for months. Michael took a sharp breath. Wait, what? The officer didn't look away from Sophie. This isn't her first time pulling something like this. He glanced at Ryan. But thanks to your son, she won't get the chance to do it again. Ryan's breath hitched. Sophie's face twisted with rage. The mask was gone. She turned to Ryan, eyes burning. You little brat, she spat. You ruined everything. Michael stepped in front of his son. No, he said, voice steel. He saved me. The officers grabbed Sophie's arms, snapping cuffs around her wrists. Ryan stood there, heart pounding, as they dragged her toward the exit. But as she was led away, she turned one last time, locking eyes with him. And then, she smirked. A chill ran down Ryan's spine, and just like that, she was gone. Ryan stood frozen, his breath coming in short gasps as the church doors slammed shut behind Sophie. The echoes of the heavy wooden doors vibrated through the silent room, the weight of what had just happened sinking in. His small fingers curled into fists, his heart still hammering in his chest. Michael remained still, his broad shoulders rising and falling with uneven breaths. He turned slowly, his gaze flickering down to his son. There was something raw in his expression, a mixture of shock, anger, and something else Ryan couldn't quite name. The murmur of the wedding guests grew louder. Whispers filled the air like static. Did that really just happen? Who is Mark? She was planning to. Jack stepped forward, running a hand through his hair. Mike, man, what the hell just happened? Michael exhaled sharply and pressed a hand against his forehead. I don't know. His voice was hoarse, unsteady. Then, as if something inside him clicked into place, he turned to Ryan, his face dark with realization. You knew. Ryan's breath caught. Michael's jaw clenched. You knew this whole time, didn't you? Ryan forced himself to nod. I tried to tell you, Dad. His voice was quiet but steady. I tried to tell you, but you wouldn't listen. Michael swallowed hard. Guilt flickered across his face, and suddenly he looked tired. Jack let out a low whistle. Damn, he muttered. That was close. The tension in the room tightened again as the doors burst open once more. This time, officers in uniform filled the entrance, their presence demanding attention. The lead officer, a tall man with graying hair, scanned the room before stepping forward. His badge glinted under the golden light of the stained glass windows. Michael Carter? Michael straightened, his posture rigid. That's me. I'm Detective Harris. We need to take your statement regarding Sophie Turner. His gaze shifted to Ryan. And yours as well, son. Ryan felt Michael's arm rest gently on his shoulder. Of course, Michael said. Whatever you need. The officers led them outside, the crisp autumn air a sharp contrast to the suffocating heat inside the church. A police cruiser idled at the curb, and just beyond it, Sophie sat in the back seat, her wrists bound in cuffs. She didn't fight. She didn't scream. She just watched, her icy blue eyes locked onto Ryan's, her expression unreadable. Ryan's stomach twisted. He knew what she was trying to do. One last mind game, one last attempt to make him doubt himself. Michael caught the look and instantly stepped in front of his son, blocking Sophie from view. Don't look at her, he muttered. Ryan let out a breath, forcing himself to turn away. Detective Harris pulled out a notepad. We've been tracking her for a while, but we didn't have enough to make an arrest. Your son changed that. His gaze flickered to Ryan, respect in his eyes. He saved your life, Mr. Carter. Michael turned to Ryan. There was no more hesitation, no more doubt, just pure, unwavering trust. I know. The detective flipped his notepad shut. She's looking at serious charges. Fraud, conspiracy, possibly even attempted murder, depending on what we find. He sighed. We still need to track down her accomplice. Mark, was it? Ryan nodded. Yeah, I saw pictures of him on her laptop. He has a scar above his left eye. Harris scribbled something down. That's helpful. We'll be in touch. A commotion by the police car drew their attention. Sophie was being escorted into the station vehicle. For the first time, her mask cracked. No, you don't understand, she snapped at the officer holding her arm. This isn't over. It's not over. The door slammed shut. Ryan exhaled slowly. Michael turned to his son, dropping to one knee, so they were eye level. Ryan, he said, his voice thick, I need you to know something. Ryan swallowed. What? I am so sorry. His father's hands rested on his shoulders, grounding him. I should have listened to you. I should have seen the signs. I should have. Ryan shook his head. You wanted to be happy, Dad. That's not wrong. Michael's throat bobbed. No, but not at the cost of losing you. Ryan felt warmth spread through his chest. For the first time in months, the fear that had been curling inside him loosened its grip. Jack, who had been standing off to the side, clapped his hands together. All right, he said. Enough of this serious stuff. I don't know about you two, but I think we deserve a damn good meal after all that. Michael let out a short, surprised laugh. You know what? You're right. He turned to Ryan. What do you say, kiddo? Ryan smiled. Pizza? Michael ruffled his hair. Stuffed crust? Ryan grinned. Definitely. As they walked toward the car, the tension of the day slowly faded into the cool evening air. The nightmare was over. Or so they thought. Because somewhere out there, Mark was still waiting. The cold night air settled over the city as Michael pulled into the driveway. The house, once filled with warmth and familiarity, now felt different. The weight of everything that had happened pressed heavily on his chest. Ryan sat in the passenger seat, unusually quiet. His small fingers fidgeted with the sleeve of his jacket, his mind clearly still caught up in the chaos of the day. Michael turned off the engine, but neither of them moved to get out. The silence stretched between them, heavy but unspoken. After a moment, Michael let out a slow breath. "You okay, buddy?" Ryan nodded, but the hesitation in his movement said otherwise. "Yeah, just tired." Michael studied his son for a long moment, then reached over and ruffled his hair. "I get it, today was a lot." Ryan swallowed, his eyes flicking toward the darkened windows of their home. "She's really gone, right?" Michael's jaw tightened, the image of Sophie's cold smirk flashing in his mind. "Yeah," he said. "She's gone." Ryan nodded again, but something about his posture remained stiff. He wasn't convinced. Michael reached for the door handle. "Come on, let's get inside, get some food, and pretend this day never happened." They stepped into the house, and the familiar scent of home wrapped around them, but it no longer felt as safe as it once did. Michael locked the door behind them, double-checking the deadbolt. It was a habit he never used to have, but tonight it felt necessary. Ryan kicked off his shoes, his movements sluggish, like the weight of the entire day had finally settled on his shoulders. Michael watched him for a moment before walking to the kitchen and grabbing his phone. He had one more call to make. The line rang twice before a familiar voice picked up. "Detective Harris." Michael exhaled. "I just wanted to check if there were any updates on Mark." A pause. "We're still looking," Harris admitted. "We've flagged all possible aliases, checked transportation records, but he's slippery." Michael ran a hand down his face. "He's dangerous, isn't he?" Another pause, this time longer. "Yes," Harris finally said. "We believe so." Michael glanced toward the living room, where Ryan had curled up on the couch, staring blankly at the TV. "If he was working with Sophie, that means he knows about me, about my son." Harris's tone shifted. "We don't have reason to believe he'd go after you, Michael. Sophie's arrest threw a wrench in whatever plan they had. If anything, he's probably running, trying to cover his tracks." Michael wasn't sure if that made him feel better or worse. "If you notice anything unusual, you call me," Harris continued. "Day or night." Michael nodded to himself. "Yeah." "Okay." He hung up and set the phone down, trying to shake the unease clinging to him. Ryan's voice broke through the silence. "Was that the detective?" Michael turned, surprised. He hadn't even noticed Ryan watching him from the couch. "Yeah," he admitted. "Just checking in." Ryan hesitated, then asked the question Michael had been dreading. "What about Mark?" Michael sighed. "They're still looking for him." Ryan's expression didn't change, but Michael saw the way his fingers gripped the blanket a little tighter. "You don't have to worry about him, Ryan." Ryan's gaze flickered up, meeting his father's. "What if he comes here?" Michael forced a reassuring smile. "He won't." But even as he said it, something deep in his gut told him he wasn't sure. Ryan didn't look convinced, but he nodded, shifting under the blanket. Michael knew he wouldn't push the conversation further, not tonight at least. He grabbed the remote and flicked through the channels. "All right, what's the plan? Movie? Video games?" Ryan hesitated, then shrugged. "I guess a movie." Michael grinned. "Good choice." They settled in, the sounds of the TV filling the space between them. For the first time that day, Michael let himself breathe. He let himself believe that maybe, just maybe, they could start to move on. But outside, under the dim glow of a streetlight, a black car sat parked, just far enough away to go unnoticed. Inside, a man watched the house. His fingers drummed against the steering wheel, his sharp eyes locked onto the front door. A small, knowing smirk curled his lips. Mark had always been patient. The night stretched over the neighborhood like a thick, suffocating blanket. Most houses had already gone dark, their occupants tucked away in bed, lost in dreams. A gentle breeze rustled through the trees, sending leaves scattering across the pavement. It was the kind of night where everything should have felt peaceful, safe. But Ryan couldn't shake the unease curling in his chest. The living room TV flickered dimly, casting shifting shadows against the walls. The movie had long since lost his attention. His fingers gripped the edge of the blanket draped over his lap, pulling it tighter around his shoulders. Every little sound, the creak of the house settling, the wind brushing against the windows, felt louder than it should have. The front door opened. Ryan jumped slightly, but it was only his dad. Michael stepped outside, exhaling a long breath as if he could push away the weight of the day. He lingered on the porch, glancing up and down the quiet street before pulling out his phone. His expression was unreadable, but Ryan had seen that look before. He was worried. Michael brought the phone to his ear. His voice was low, almost too quiet for Ryan to hear. Still nothing? A pause. His shoulders stiffened slightly. Yeah, I figured. Just keep me updated. Another pause. A nod. Then he ran a hand through his hair before hanging up. He stayed there for another few seconds, staring out into the night like he was waiting for something. Or someone. Finally he turned and stepped back inside, locking the door behind him. Ryan swallowed, the unease deepening. Michael caught his gaze and tried for a reassuring smile. You should get some sleep, bud. Ryan hesitated. The words were on the tip of his tongue, but he wasn't sure how to say them without sounding paranoid. He shifted on the couch, gripping the blanket a little tighter. Can I sleep in your room tonight? Michael blinked, surprised. Of course, he said without hesitation. Ryan let out a breath of relief and stood, dragging his blanket with him as he followed his dad up the stairs. Before turning the corner, he cast one last glance toward the front door. The lock was in place, but it still didn't feel like enough. The upstairs hall was dark, but familiar. Safe. Michael pushed open his bedroom door, stepping aside to let Ryan in first. Go ahead and take the left side, he said. I'll be right back. Ryan nodded and climbed onto the bed, wrapping himself in the comforter. He listened as his father moved through the house, double-checking windows, making sure everything was secure. The distant sound of water running in the bathroom, the soft creak of a door closing. Eventually, Michael returned, sighing as he sat on the edge of the bed. All right, he murmured. Try to get some rest. Ryan wanted to. He really did. But even as he closed his eyes, the uneasy feeling didn't fade. It sat there, just beneath the surface, refusing to let go. Somewhere outside, a black car sat parked just far enough away to stay hidden in the shadows. The headlights were off. The engine was silent. But Mark was still there. His fingers drummed lazily against the steering wheel as he watched the house, waiting. Through the living room window, he had seen the faint outline of the boy curled up on the couch. Small, fragile, the kind of kid who noticed things he shouldn't. He'd always hated kids like that. The front door had opened. Michael had stepped outside, scanned the street, made the call. Checking. Always checking. But he didn't see everything. Mark smirked to himself. He had to admit, Sophie had done a number on the guy. Michael wasn't stupid, but he wasn't thinking clearly either. Not yet. He was still playing defense, still reacting. That wouldn't last. One by one, the lights in the house flickered off. Mark watched. He waited 10 minutes, 15, 20. Then, without a sound, he reached for the door handle. The lockpick kit was already in his pocket. The night air was thick, heavy with silence. The kind of silence that made even the smallest sounds seem deafening. Mark moved with the ease of someone who had done this before, his boots barely making a whisper against the pavement. His breath was slow, measured. There was no rush. He had waited this long. A few more minutes wouldn't hurt. The house stood in front of him. Dark except for the faintest glow slipping through the curtains upstairs. A bedroom light. Maybe Michael's. Maybe the kids'. It didn't matter. He reached the porch steps and paused, listening. No movement inside. No voices. Good. His fingers slipped into his pocket, pulling out the lockpick kit. It was old, the edges of the leather worn smooth from use. He selected the right tool without hesitation, fitting it into the keyhole with a steady hand. One turn, a small click, another turn. The lock gave way. Slowly, he twisted the knob, easing the door open just enough to slip inside. The house smelled like wood polish and something faintly citrus, maybe a candle that had burned earlier in the evening. It was quiet, save for the steady hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. The living room was just ahead, the glow of the TV still flickering, casting restless shadows across the walls. Mark closed the door behind him, careful to turn the knob so it wouldn't make a sound. He stayed there for a moment, letting his eyes adjust to the darkness. Upstairs, something creaked, his head tilted slightly. Footsteps. Soft, hesitant. The kid? He moved forward, his steps careful, calculated. The carpet muted most of the sound, but he knew better than to rush. He scanned the space quickly, No security cameras, no alarm system. Michael had always been too trusting. That's what had made him an easy target in the first place. Mark's fingers ghosted over the back of the couch as he walked past, his eyes flicking toward the staircase. The house was older, and old houses made noise. He had to be careful. He reached the first step, shifting his weight onto the ball of his foot to keep the wood from creaking. Another step. Then another. A floorboard groaned above him. He froze. His breath slowed. Something wasn't right. Ryan lay in bed, eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling. The blanket was pulled up to his chin, but it did nothing to ease the unease twisting in his stomach. Something felt off. He wasn't sure what had woken him. Maybe a noise, maybe just the heavy weight of dread pressing down on his chest. Then he heard it. The faintest shift of movement downstairs. His heart stuttered. For a long moment he didn't move, didn't breathe. Maybe he was imagining it. Maybe it was just the house settling. But then, another sound. Soft, deliberate. Someone was inside. He turned his head slowly, careful not to make any sudden movements. His dad was still asleep, his breathing even. He hesitated, debating whether to wake him, but something deep in his gut told him to move first, think later. With painstaking slowness, Ryan slid out of bed. His socked feet barely made a whisper against the hardwood floor. He crouched low, creeping toward the door. The hallway was dark, but his eyes had already adjusted. He reached for the baseball bat leaning against the wall. The gift from his dad 2 birthdays ago. It felt heavier than usual in his hands. Another sound. This time closer. Ryan pressed his back against the wall, his grip tightening around the bat. The stairs. Someone was on the stairs. His pulse pounded in his ears, drowning out everything else. He wanted to run, to shake his dad awake, to scream, but instinct told him that would be a mistake. So instead he waited. Mark took another step. Something was off. The house had felt too quiet, too still, like it was holding its breath. Then, a sound. Soft, almost nothing, but enough. He turned his head, eyes narrowing. There, at the end of the hallway, just barely visible in the dim light, the kid, holding a bat. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Mark smiled. Ryan's breath caught in his throat. The man took another step forward, slow, purposeful. Ryan tightened his grip. His knuckles went white. Then he swung. The bat sliced through the air with everything Ryan had. He barely registered the way his arms ached from the force of the swing. He just knew he had to make it count. Mark reacted fast. Too fast. He twisted to the side at the last second, the wooden bat missing his ribs by inches. Instead of connecting with flesh, it slammed into the doorframe with a sharp crack, sending splinters flying. Ryan stumbled forward, his momentum throwing him off balance. Mark struck. A hand shot out, grabbing the bat mid-air, yanking it from Ryan's grip with an ease that made the boy's stomach drop. Ryan barely had time to react before he was shoved back against the wall, the impact sending a jolt of pain through his shoulder. For the first time, he saw Mark up close. The dim hallway light barely illuminated the man's face, but Ryan saw enough. The sharp angle of his jaw, the scar above his left eyebrow, the way his dark eyes gleamed with something cold and knowing. Not like Sophie. She had been cruel in a way that felt manipulative, calculated. Mark was different. He enjoyed this. Ryan's breath came in short, sharp gasps. He needed to move. He needed to do something. Mark tilted his head slightly, considering him, fingers still wrapped around the bat. "Not bad, kid," he murmured, his voice too calm, too amused. Ryan's heart slammed against his ribs. His legs were stiff, but he forced himself to take a step back, then another, inching toward the doorway. If he could just make it to his dad? Mark saw the movement and smiled. "You're smart. I like that." He flipped the bat effortlessly in his hand, testing its weight. "But you should have aimed for the knees." Ryan bolted. Mark lunged. Ryan barely made it 2 steps before fingers clamped around the back of his hoodie, yanking him back with brutal force. His feet left the ground for a split second before he hit the floor hard, the air rushing from his lungs in a painful gasp. The house wasn't quiet anymore. A thud from the struggle, footsteps pounding. Mark turned sharply just as Michael's bedroom door flew open. Michael was already moving, his face still groggy from sleep, but his body fueled by nothing but pure instinct. He didn't hesitate. His eyes locked onto the stranger standing over his son. He charged. Mark barely had time to lift the bat before Michael slammed into him with full force, sending them both crashing into the hallway wall. Ryan scrambled back, coughing as he tried to regain his breath. He felt the sharp sting of carpet burn on his palms, but ignored it, eyes wide as his dad and Mark struggled in the dim light. Michael threw a punch that landed hard, knocking Mark's head back against the drywall. The man grunted, his grip loosening on the bat. Ryan saw his chance. He lunged forward, fingers wrapping around the bat before Mark could recover. Mark moved to grab it back, but Ryan swung blindly, this time connecting with his knee. Mark let out a snarl of pain, staggering back. Michael didn't waste the opportunity. He grabbed Mark by the collar and slammed him into the floor, pinning him down with all his weight. His forearm pressed against Mark's throat, forcing him to stay still. Mark coughed, struggling beneath him, but Michael didn't let up. "You picked the wrong house," Michael growled, voice edged with something Ryan had never heard before. Something dangerous. Ryan didn't realize he was shaking until his dad turned to him. "Ryan?" Michael's voice softened just slightly. "Get my phone, now." Ryan didn't need to be told twice. He turned and sprinted toward the bedroom, his hands fumbling as he grabbed the phone off the nightstand. His fingers shook as he dialed. 911. The call barely rang once before someone answered. 911, what's your emergency? Ryan gulped, trying to steady his voice. "Someone broke into our house. My dad. He's fighting him." "Are you safe?" Ryan turned, his breath still ragged. Michael was holding Mark down, but the man was still struggling, his movements jerky and wild. "No," Ryan whispered. "Please hurry." Ryan's hands were shaking so badly that he almost dropped the phone. He pressed it harder against his ear, forcing himself to focus on the voice on the other end. "Stay on the line with me," the dispatcher said, her tone calm but urgent. "Officers are on their way. Can you tell me if the intruder is armed?" Ryan's throat felt dry. His eyes flicked to the hallway, where his father was still pinning Mark to the floor. The man thrashed beneath Michael's grip, his breath coming in ragged at furious bursts. I don't know," Ryan admitted. "He had a bat, but I took it." The dispatcher's voice remained steady. "That's good. Keep yourself safe. Where are you right now?" Ryan took a step back toward the doorway, never taking his eyes off his father and Mark. "I'm still in the bedroom," he whispered. "But my dad, he's still fighting him." A low snarl of frustration came from the hallway as Mark shifted his weight sharply, using the strength in his legs to buck Michael off just enough to loosen the hold on his throat. Ryan's pulse spiked with fear. Michael reacted fast, shifting his grip and trying to regain control. But Mark wasn't just some random burglar. He knew how to fight. With a violent twist, Mark broke free. Ryan's breath hitched as his father stumbled back, momentarily thrown off balance. Mark's eyes were wild, his chest heaving as he rolled onto his hands and knees, ready to lunge. Ryan didn't think. He acted. He grabbed the bat, gripping it so tightly his knuckles turned white, and charged into the hallway. Mark saw him at the last second, eyes narrowing. He lunged forward, his hands aiming for the bat, but Ryan had already swung with everything he had. The wooden bat slammed into Mark's shoulder with a sickening thud. A guttural yell tore from the man's throat as he staggered back, clutching his arm. Michael didn't hesitate. He lunged again, this time with pure force, knocking Mark onto his back. Ryan stumbled back, breathing hard, his arms burning from the swing. His heart thundered in his chest, but he barely registered the exhaustion creeping into his limbs. Michael had both knees pressed against Mark's chest now, pinning him firmly against the floor. Mark gritted his teeth, his face contorted with rage, but he was trapped. Sirens. Ryan's head snapped toward the window as the distant wail of police sirens cut through the night. Mark heard them too. For the first time, his expression changed. The fury didn't fade, but something else crept into his dark eyes. Calculation. Michael saw it too. "Don't even think about it," he growled. Mark stopped struggling, but the tension in his body remained coiled, like a predator waiting for the right moment to strike. The sirens grew louder. Red and blue lights flashed outside, casting eerie shadows across the walls. Heavy footsteps pounded up the porch. Then bang, bang, bang! "Police!" a voice shouted. "Open up!" Michael didn't move off Mark. His jaw was clenched so tight that Ryan could see the muscle in his cheek twitch. "The door's unlocked," Ryan called out, his voice still shaky. The front door burst open, and 3 officers stormed inside, their weapons raised. "Get off him, sir," one of them barked. Michael hesitated, his breathing ragged. His hands were still fisted in Mark's shirt, his knuckles white from the pressure. Then slowly he lifted his hands and backed away. The officers moved in instantly. Ryan watched, his chest rising and falling rapidly, as they flipped Mark onto his stomach and cuffed his wrists behind his back. "You're under arrest," one officer said, his voice clipped and professional. "You have the right to remain silent," Mark laughed, a low, humorless chuckle that sent a shiver down Ryan's spine. Michael stiffened. "What the hell is so funny?" Mark turned his head slightly, just enough for his cold, dark eyes to land on Ryan. "You're a tough kid," he murmured. "I'll give you that." Ryan's stomach churned. One of the officers yanked Mark back to his feet, but before they could drag him outside, he spoke again. One last parting gift. "This isn't over." Then he was gone, shoved out the front door and into the flashing lights. Michael turned to Ryan instantly. "Are you okay?" Ryan couldn't speak. His throat felt tight, his chest too heavy. Michael crouched down, gripping his shoulders. "Ryan, look at me. You're safe." Ryan finally met his father's gaze, and for the first time all night, he let himself believe it. The front door slammed shut, muffling the chaos outside. The flashing red and blue lights from the police cars flickered through the curtains, casting eerie shadows along the walls. Ryan's breath was still unsteady, his body trembling from the rush of adrenaline. He could hear the muffled voices of the officers outside, radio chatter, the sound of a car door opening. Mark was gone, handcuffed, taken away. But his words still echoed in Ryan's head. "This isn't over." Michael's hands rested firmly on his son's shoulders, grounding him. "Ryan," his voice was steady, calm, but his eyes searched Ryan's face with concern. "Talk to me, buddy. Are you hurt?" Ryan shook his head quickly. "No, I'm okay." The words felt hollow. Michael's jaw clenched, his hands tightening slightly before he exhaled, forcing himself to relax. "Come here." Ryan barely had time to react before his father pulled him into a tight hug. The warmth of his embrace, the steady rise and fall of his chest, the solidness of his arms, it was the first thing that had felt safe all night. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Ryan buried his face into his father's shoulder, his fingers clutching onto his shirt like he was afraid to let go. Michael held him just as tightly, one hand protectively cradling the back of his head. A throat cleared behind them. Michael didn't let go, but he turned his head slightly to see Detective Harris standing in the entryway, his badge clipped to his belt. He looked different in person, taller, broader than he had sounded over the phone. His expression was unreadable, his eyes sharp as he surveyed the scene. "You okay, kid?" Harris asked. Ryan hesitated before nodding. Harris turned to Michael next. "You?" Michael exhaled slowly, his grip on Ryan not loosening. "Yeah." Harris gave a slight nod. "Good, because we need to talk." Michael's arms tightened protectively around Ryan for half a second before he finally pulled back, resting his hands on Ryan's shoulders. "Go sit down, bud. I'll be right there." Ryan hesitated, glancing between the two men. Michael softened. "I'm not going anywhere. Just sit tight, okay?" Ryan nodded reluctantly and walked toward the couch. His legs felt heavy, exhaustion finally catching up to him. His body ached from the tension of the night, but his mind was still wired, still spinning. Michael watched him go before turning back to Harris. "Tell me you have something on this guy." Harris let out a slow breath. "Mark Foster, formerly known as Mark Holloway, multiple aliases. He's been on our radar for a while, but he's slippery. We know he and Sophie ran scams together, but this," he gestured to the house, "this is the first time he's gone this far." Michael folded his arms tightly across his chest. "So what happens now?" Harris's expression hardened. "He's in custody, but don't think for a second that means you can let your guard down." Michael's stomach twisted. "We've got enough to hold him for breaking and entering, aggravated assault, and conspiracy," Harris continued, his tone grim. "But a guy like him, he knows how to manipulate the system. If he gets a good lawyer, he'll find a way to negotiate a deal." Michael felt something cold settle in his chest. "So you're saying he could get out?" Harris hesitated. "I'm saying it's possible." Michael's jaw clenched. He ran a hand down his face, exhaustion threatening to pull him under. He had thought this was over, that Ryan was safe. Now it felt like the nightmare was just beginning. Ryan was still curled up on the couch, his small hands gripping the blanket tightly. He wasn't watching the TV, he was watching them. Listening. Michael forced himself to stay calm. He turned back to Harris. "What do I need to do?" Harris studied him for a long moment before reaching into his pocket and pulling out a business card. "First, you install a security system. Cameras, alarms, the works." Michael took the card, glancing at the number printed on it. "And second?" Harris's expression darkened. "You watch your back." The night felt heavier now. Even with Mark handcuffed and taken away, a suffocating weight settled over the house, thick like smoke that refused to clear. The flashing police lights outside had dimmed, but the tension inside hadn't faded. Michael stood near the entryway, gripping Detective Harris's card so tightly his knuckles turned white. His other hand ran through his hair, the exhaustion of the night finally hitting him in full force. Across the room, Ryan sat curled up on the couch, his knees drawn to his chest, his fingers clenched around the edge of the blanket. He wasn't shaking anymore, but he wasn't okay either. Michael saw it, the way his son's eyes kept flickering toward the front door, as if expecting it to burst open again. He'd never forgive himself for letting it get this far. Harris shifted, tucking his notepad back into his pocket. "We'll keep you updated. I'll push to keep Foster locked up, but I meant what I said. Don't let your guard down." Michael forced himself to focus. "If he gets out, you'll let me know?" Harris nodded. "You'll be the first call I make." His gaze flickered toward Ryan before lowering his voice. "But if I were you, I wouldn't wait for that call to start preparing." Michael exhaled slowly. He already knew that. Harris gave a small nod, then turned toward the door. "We'll have an officer patrol the area for the next few nights. But if anything feels off, don't wait. Call me." Michael followed him to the door, locking it behind him as the detective stepped outside. The red and blue lights of the remaining squad cars flashed one last time before fading into the distance. Silence settled over the house again. For the first time in hours, they were alone. Michael turned, his gaze falling back on his son. Ryan was still staring at the door. Michael's chest tightened. He walked over slowly, lowering himself onto the couch beside him. Ryan didn't look up. Michael hesitated before speaking. "Hey." His voice was quiet, careful. "It's over." Ryan's fingers tightened on the blanket. "That's what you said last time." Michael swallowed hard. "And I was wrong." He hated admitting it. Hated the guilt pressing down on him like a weight he couldn't lift. "But this time, I swear to you, we're going to be ready." Ryan finally turned to face him. "How?" Michael hesitated for only a second before answering. "We're getting security cameras, alarm systems, locks that not even a professional could pick." He tapped the card Harris had given him. "And we're getting help." Ryan didn't look convinced. Michael leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees. "Ryan, listen to me. I'm never letting something like this happen again. Do you hear me?" Ryan searched his father's face, as if trying to figure out whether he really meant it. After a moment, he gave a small nod. Michael reached over, squeezing the back of his son's neck gently, the same way he used to when Ryan was little. "We're safe tonight," he said. "Let's start there." Ryan let out a slow breath, nodding again. Michael exhaled, leaning back into the couch. His whole body ached with exhaustion, but he couldn't sleep yet. Not until he was sure. Ryan hesitated, then shifted closer, resting his head against his dad's arm. He didn't say anything, but Michael felt it, the unspoken need for reassurance, for protection. So he stayed awake. Even as the house settled into silence, even as Ryan's breathing evened out and his body relaxed, Michael kept his eyes on the door, waiting, watching. Because Mark's words still echoed in his mind. This isn't over. And Michael knew better than to ignore a threat like that ever again. The morning light crept through the curtains, casting soft golden streaks across the living room floor. For the first time in what felt like forever, the house was quiet, not the heavy, suffocating kind of silence from the night before, but a peaceful stillness. Ryan stirred against his father's arm, blinking as his mind slowly registered where he was. He was still curled up on the couch, wrapped in his blanket, the warmth of his dad beside him making him feel safer than he had in days. Michael was awake. He hadn't slept, not really. His eyes were tired, but his body remained alert, his mind replaying every second of the break-in, every moment that could have ended differently. He had stayed up watching the front door, listening for anything out of place, making sure Ryan was safe. But now, as the sun rose higher, something in his chest finally loosened. Ryan sat up, rubbing his eyes. "Did you sleep at all?" Michael exhaled a small chuckle, ruffling his son's hair. "A little." Ryan gave him a look that clearly didn't believe him, but he let it go. For the first time since it all started, Ryan wasn't filled with the same overwhelming fear that had followed him every second of the past few weeks. It wasn't gone, not completely, but it wasn't paralyzing anymore. There was a knock at the door. Michael immediately tensed, his muscles coiling. His first instinct was to shield Ryan, but when he glanced at the peephole, he let out a breath. "Detective Harris." Michael opened the door, stepping aside to let the detective in. Ryan sat up straighter, watching closely, his fingers gripping the blanket tightly. Harris's expression was unreadable as he pulled out a small notepad. "I wanted to update you before the media gets a hold of this." Michael folded his arms. "What happened?" Harris sighed, glancing between father and son before speaking. "Mark Foster won't be bothering you again." The words hung in the air for a long moment. Ryan's breath caught. Michael's jaw clenched. "What do you mean?" Harris hesitated for only a second before closing his notepad. "He tried to escape transport this morning, attacked an officer. He didn't make it." Silence. Ryan's mind struggled to process what that meant. The man who had broken into their home, who had threatened their lives, who had told him this wasn't over, was gone. Just like that. Michael's shoulders relaxed slightly, but he didn't speak right away. A part of him didn't trust it, didn't believe it. But as Harris stood there, firm and unwavering, reality began to set in. This time, it really was over. Ryan swallowed. "Are you sure?" Harris nodded. "Yeah, kid, it's done." Michael placed a firm hand on Ryan's shoulder, squeezing gently. He could feel the tension slowly melting away, the weight of fear they had been carrying for so long finally lifting. Harris handed Michael a card. "If you ever need anything, questions, concerns, you call me. But as far as Mark Foster goes, you don't have to look over your shoulder anymore." Michael studied the card for a moment before nodding. "Thanks, Harris." The detective gave Ryan a small, reassuring smile before heading for the door. As it clicked shut behind him, the house fell into a different kind of silence, a peaceful one. Michael let out a long breath, one he hadn't even realized he had been holding. He turned to Ryan, expecting to see relief on his face, but instead his son looked thoughtful. Ryan was staring at the floor, his brows furrowed slightly. "Dad? Yeah?" Ryan hesitated, then looked up. "Do you think Sophie knew?" Michael paused. The question caught him off guard. Ryan kept going. "About Mark, about him breaking in, do you think she planned it? Or was he just acting on his own?" Michael exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know, bud." And that was the truth. "But it doesn't matter now. Neither of them can hurt us anymore." Ryan nodded slowly, as if letting that truth settle into his bones. Michael crouched down in front of his son, resting a hand on his knee. "Hey, we're okay. We made it through this." Ryan's eyes met his father's. There was still some fear there, some memories that would take time to fade. But there was something else too, strength. Michael smiled, ruffling Ryan's hair again. "And you, my man, you're a damn hero." Ryan gave a small, tired grin. "I had a good teacher." Michael laughed. "That's debatable." For the first time in what felt like forever, the weight pressing down on them was finally gone. Michael stood, stretching. "What do you say we make some breakfast?" Ryan's stomach grumbled loudly in response. Michael smirked. "Pancakes it is." They moved to the kitchen together, the tension of the past few weeks finally fading into something lighter. For the first time, their home felt safe again, and that was all that mattered.